Hello everyone. Welcome to the analysis of the budget and economic survey. I do know that you guys have been waiting for this particular special session, but I was a little busy with respect to the foundation classes. That's the reason the delay has taken place with respect to conducting these special sessions. But let me assure you that once we start the budget and economic survey session from today onwards, in next 20 days, we shall be completing the entire discussion of both budget as well as economic survey. So, with respect to the discussion of budget and economic survey, just like last time, what I have done is the announcements made in the budget as well as various chapters included in the economic survey. I have clubbed them under the different pillars as per your UPSC prelims as well as the mains examination. So as you can see, broadly, I have clubbed the budget announcements and economic survey chapters into almost around 6 pillars, which we will be covering over a period of time. As far as this session is concerned, in this session, I shall be confining myself to the pillar of growth and development. And in this particular pillar, I will be discussing the background to the union budget and the two chapters from economic survey, which is chapter 1 and chapter 5. In the subsequent videos, we shall be covering the remaining pillars. So understand that I'm covering budget and economic survey from perspective of your examination, but converting this budget and economic survey into different pillars. So let's start with the background to the Union Budget 25-26. See, we all know that presently Indian economy is the 5th largest economy in the world. In terms of purchasing power parity, it is right now considered to be the 3rd largest economy. Accordingly, we have come up with a vision to become Viksit Bharat by 2047. This year's economic survey has pointed out that in order to become Viksit Bharat, the real GDP growth rate should be at least 8% for more than a decade. However, the real GDP growth rate presently in India is hovering somewhere between 6 to 6.5%. So obviously, one of the challenges before the Indian economy is to increase the real GDP growth rate. So keeping this in mind, let's understand the background to the union budget. The idea here is not to discuss the announcements made in the budget and economic survey, but the idea here is to make you understand what went behind before the formulation of budget and economic survey, right? It being said that in order to become Viksit Bharat, India is facing challenges both on domestic front as well as global front. Let's start with the global front. You all know what exactly is globalization, right? Globalization refers to free movement of goods, investment, as well as people. And if you look at the globalization, right, in the past, countries have prospered by integrating themselves into global economy. For example, if a country gets integrated into global economy, such a country would be able to import critical raw materials from rest of the world. After importing the raw materials, it can process the raw materials into finished products, most of which would be consumed within a particular country. But the surplus finished products can well be exported to other countries, which means a particular country is not only catering to domestic demand, it is also catering to the global demand, and by doing so, it can achieve a far higher GDP size. With respect to investment, a particular country can attract more foreign investment. When more foreign investment, particularly FDI, comes into a particular country, that FDI is accompanied by advanced technology, better management skills. So the entry of foreign firms will infuse competition in the economy, leading to increase in efficiency and productivity. And obviously, it will lead to creation of more number of jobs. At the same time, as far as people are concerned, what a particular country can do is country can actually export human resources, particularly when a country has abundance of human resources. By exporting human resources to other countries, such a country can earn huge amount of money in the form of remittances, right? So if you go back in economic history, a number of countries have prospered by integrating themselves into global economy. Example include Great Britain in the past, USA, and China recently. Think of Britain. Now, during the start of Industrial Revolution, what did Britain do? It treated India as a supplier of raw material and a market for finished goods. By doing so, it led to success of Green Revolution in Britain. Same, after the Second World War ended, the US economy grew rapidly thanks to globalization. So after Second World War ended, a number of international institutions and agreements came into being. Case in point is IMF, World Bank, and multilateral agreement, that is GATT, which led to rapid increase in trade at a global level, which ultimately benefited USA. And I can say the same thing with respect to China, which is heavily reliant on export-led model. So it is that in the past, whenever countries started to grow, the global economy was aligned. The global economy was open in terms of trade, in terms of investment, in terms of people, which enabled these economies to grow faster. What about India? So India aspires to become the Viksit Bharat developed country by 2047, right? For that, stars should be aligned in favor of India. When I say stars, I'm referring to global economy. Unfortunately, the global economy has become now more closed than it was before. For example, the economic survey this year has pointed out that we are witnessing what is called as geo-economic fragmentation. Geo-economic fragmentation means slowly globalization is giving way to slow ballization. Slow ballization basically means there is restriction with respect to movement of goods, movement of investment, and movement of people. That can be seen in terms of US China trade war, reciprocal tariffs being proposed by the Trump administration, China plus one strategy, H1B restrictions imposed on the movement of Indian professionals into US, right? So all of these are now a big problem for the Indian economy. So for these countries, it was much easier to grow rapidly because the global economy was more open in terms of goods, investment, and people. But for India, it is more problematic because of the geo-economic fragmentation. So the theme of this year's economic survey is obviously we cannot rely on shared prosperity through free movement of goods, investment, technology, and people. Rather than focusing on external factors, now India has to focus more upon the domestic factors, that is the domestic levers. So what are these domestic factors? So we all know how GDP is calculated, right? GDP, according to expenditure method, is calculated as private final consumption expenditure, government final consumption expenditure, gross capital formation plus net exports. Obviously, net exports is a problem because of geo-economic fragmentation. So now the factors that will pull forward Indian economy would be gross capital formation as well as private final consumption expenditure. So let's understand what has happened to gross capital formation. See, almost 4 to 5 years back, the government actually reduced the corporate tax rates. The idea was reduction in corporate tax rate would encourage more private sector investment in the Indian economy. Unfortunately, in spite of reduction in the corporate tax rate, private sector investment has failed to pick up. So right now, if you see the gross capital formation, it is around 31% of India's GDP. And to become Viksit Bharat, economic survey says that this gross capital formation should increase to at least 35%. But the problem is private sector investment is not coming forth. On analyzing the reasons as to why private sector is reluctant to make investment, the economists have pointed out that one of the main reason is that the consumer demand in the economy has been waning, has been reducing. So just imagine if the demand does not pick up or if the demand for goods are and services is lower, this will be a inhibiting factor for the private sector companies to make investment. So we need to fire on both the cylinders. These two cylinders are private final consumption expenditure and gross capital formation. How would you do it? And that is what budget has done. So we all know in this year's budget, one of the biggest announcement made by the finance minister is tax rebate for the people who are earning income up to rupees 12 lakh. In a way, it means that for someone who is earning up to rupees 12 lakh, there is no income tax burden. So, if people do not pay tax, what will happen to their disposable income? Disposable income of the people would increase. And if disposable income of the people increase, there are two possibilities. Possibility number one, some people may prefer to save that additional income, maybe in the form of deposits with the banks. Maybe they can make investment in shares. They can make investment in bonds. So one thing which can happen because of tax rebate is savings in the economy could increase. Possibility number two, if disposable income increase, people may prefer to purchase more goods and services. So can you see the effect of tax rebates is that on one hand, possibilities savings could increase. On other hand, demand could increase. So if savings increases, it will lead to increase in gross capital formation, investment. And if the demand increases, ultimately, it will encourage private sector to make more amount of investment in the economy. So broadly, the finance minister has decided to fire from both the cylinders, which is consumption expenditure and investment, by announcing for tax rebates. This is one of the biggest announcements from the budget. Apart from that, if I could go into a little more details from the economic survey, Economic survey has highlighted that the government rules and regulations with respect to utilization of factors of production. Factors of production is land, labor, buildings. So the economic survey has highlighted that government regulations with respect to utilization of factors of productions are very, very stringent. And because they are very stringent, the problem it is leading to is a classical problem which was even highlighted earlier as well. It is called as regulatory cholesterol. What is this regulatory cholesterol? You know, in human body, there's good cholesterol as well as bad cholesterol. What happens if the bad cholesterol in the human body increases? It will lead to development of blockages in the arteries, which may have an adverse effect on the health of a person, right? It can lead to cardiac problems. Same way, if there is excess of regulations in the economy, those excess of regulations will inhibit the companies from efficiently utilizing the factors of production, which is land, labor, as well as building. And if you don't utilize the factors of production efficiently, the productivity of Indian economy will be lower. And our objective to achieve the vision of Viksit Bharat would become more difficult. Accordingly, one of the prescriptions of this year's economic survey is we would have to go for systematic deregulation, where the regulation should be very apt. The regulation should not be over regulation. So we need to find a right balance. That is the theme of this year's economic survey. So what I've done is basically I have given you an idea about the budget as well as economic survey. All of these things in detail we will be covering in this particular session. For example, I will be covering about geo-economic fragmentation, and I shall also be covering about what is this systematic deregulation. So let's start our discussion with respect to the global economy first, and then we'll take up these things one by one. Okay, if you see the previous year prelims, in previous year prelims, questions are generally asked from Indian economy. Apart from Indian economy, UPSC has also been asking questions related to some important aspects of global economy, especially some important global economic developments. For example, in prelims 2024, you had this particular question about what would happen if the US government default on repayment of its borrowings. This question was asked in the wake of US debt ceiling crisis, which was in news in May 2023. In 2024 prelims, there was another question about the economic crisis in Venezuela. In 2023, there was the question about interest rate hikes by the global central banks. And this was in news in the wake of synchronized rate hike by central banks, which was covered in that year's economic survey. Further, in prelims 2023, there was a question as to who is the largest exporter of gold. And this question was asked in the wake of the rush among the central banks to buy more amount of gold in order to build forex reserves. So in 2022, because the rate of inflation was rising, central banks started purchasing more gold to build up the forex reserves, which was in news. And this is how UPSC had asked the question. So based upon the question which I have showed you, what you must understand is, if there are some important global economic developments, on those important global economic developments, UPSC would ask you a question. So while discussing economic survey, I'm not confining myself just to economic survey. I'm also going to cover some important global economic developments which might be asked in your UPSC prelims examination. Let's first start with a glance of the global economy. So one important development which has taken place at a global level is Germany has now overtaken Japan to become the world's third largest economy. Now let me tell you, there is a very interesting story here. If you see last 2 years, that is 2023 and 2024, for last 2 years, there was contraction in the GDP size of Germany. In spite of that contraction in the GDP size, look what has happened. Germany has overtaken Japan. This is very interesting. Why it has overtaken Japan? We will cover that part later. Apart from that, another development is India may become the world's third largest economy by 2030. So presently, if you rank the countries in their GDP size, nominal GDP, US is the world's largest economy with a GDP size of $27 trillion, followed by China, Germany, Japan, and India. India is presently placed at 5th position. And in terms of purchasing power parity, China is placed at the first place, followed by US at second place, and India as third place. So India ranks third in terms of purchasing power parity. In one of the earlier prelims, a question was asked with respect to India's ranking on purchasing power parity. That is why it becomes important. And if you rank countries in terms of their GDP growth rate, the countries which have highest GDP growth rate are usually the smaller economies like Macau, Guyana, Palau, and so on. But if you look at the GDP growth rate among the major economies, big economies, among the major economies, India is ranked at the first place. So these are some prelims pointers that you should know. Next is with respect to the global GDP growth rate. What has happened to the global GDP growth rate? According to economic survey, it has highlighted that in the year 2024, the global GDP growth rate was 3.2, and this year 2025 it is supposed to be at 3.3%. So the global economy has moved away from COVID-19 pandemic clearly, which shows that there is a steady growth now. But the problem, as pointed out by economic survey, is even though the growth is steady, the growth unfortunately is uneven. Why is it uneven? It is being said that there are some big economies at a global level which are facing unprecedented crisis. Which are these countries? First, Germany. So like I said, Germany can be considered to be one of the economic powerhouse of European Union. But for last 2 years, there was contraction in the GDP size of Germany. That is one problem. Second problem is, as far as China is concerned, China is facing a crisis called as real estate crisis. It is facing crisis in the real estate sector. And as far as Japan is concerned, until now, that is 2 years back, Japan was facing the problem of deflation, that is decrease in prices, which was leading to economic stagnation. But now the problem in Japan in last 1 year has got reversed, wherein now the problem which Japan is facing is not deflation, rather it is facing inflation, increase in prices, and that has caused problem for the Japanese economy. So if you think of the big economies, we are facing problem in Germany, we are facing problem in China as well as Japan. What are these problems? We will get into in the next part. As far as the global economy is concerned, there are two dominant sectors. One is manufacturing sector, other one is services sector. As far as the manufacturing sector is concerned, economic survey has pointed out that in most of the major economies, manufacturing sector has contracted. Why has it contracted? The reasons are multiple. The reasons include geopolitical tensions like Russia-Ukraine war, global supply chain disruptions, higher tariffs imposed by some countries, restrictions on free flow of capital. Because of all of these reasons, the global manufacturing, in a way, has come down. But one good thing is, even though manufacturing has stagnated, the services sector, particularly in few economies, has boomed. So, whatever GDP growth rate that you're witnessing in the global economy, it is all thanks to services sector. So, if the services sector had also stagnated, or if it had also faced a kind of slowdown, probably the world GDP growth rate would have been far lower. Apart from that, let's look at inflation, the global inflation. To give you a backdrop about inflation, during COVID-19, the central banks in the advanced economies pumped in huge amount of money in order to revive the economy affected by slowdown. Obviously, that was the need of the hour. But it so happened that when the COVID-19 pandemic ended, these economies had surplus amount of money. And you know what happens if there's surplus amount of money? It will lead to inflation. In fact, in 2022, the rate of inflation in most of the major economies had skyrocketed. You can very well see the rate of inflation in countries such as US, UK, EU was very high. It being said, US faced an inflation of almost 40-year high. EU faced an inflation of almost 50-year high. If the rate of inflation is higher, what will the central bank of a country do? Central bank of a country will adopt contractionary policy. So, because of contractionary policies adopted by the central banks in these countries, can you see how the rate of inflation has now got reduced in most of the economies? In fact, in emerging economies also, the rate of inflation has got reduced. In fact, this was a question which was asked in prelims 2023. But at the same time, economic survey highlights that there is a danger that inflation could increase in future. Why it can increase? Problem number one is geopolitical tensions. An example of which is Russia-Ukraine war led to shortage of some important commodities like crude oil, fertilizers, edible oil, and because of shortage of these commodities, there was very high rate of inflation at a global level. Same way, think of it, if US starts increasing the custom duty on import of goods from other countries as promised by Trump, what will happen to cost of imports into US? Cost of imports into US would increase, and there is a danger that inflation rate in US, which actually got reduced, may well start increasing. So obviously, the first one is geopolitical tension. Second one is there could be climate change induced weather disruptions. This is the second problem, which can lead to fall in agricultural output. Shortage of agriculture commodities may lead to increase in their prices. This is the second reason. But there's a third reason as well. You know that transportation of goods from one country to another actually takes place through ships. And to measure the rate of transportation, to what extent there has been increase in the cost of transportation through ships, we have an index called as Baltic Dry Index. Baltic Dry Index is published by London based Baltic Exchange. So it keeps a track of what is the cost of moving the raw materials through ships. Economic Survey has pointed out that the Baltic Dry Index, even though it has got stabilized now, the Baltic Dry Index could increase in future because of the disruption to the shipping lanes across the world. For example, because of tensions in Middle East, the ships which were earlier traveling through Red Sea have now changed course. Now they are required to take a longer route through Cape of Good Hope. Longer route means higher transportation cost. Higher transportation cost means cost of raw materials will increase, and which might lead to inflation. Right? So please know some important details about Baltic Dry Index, which can be asked from the perspective of your prelims examination. So you can see Baltic Dry Index provides an assessment of the price of moving the major raw materials by sea. So in a way, it is measuring the cost of transporting raw materials by sea. It is published by London based Baltic Exchange. Two things that you need to know. Similar to Baltic Dry Index, which is for all the major raw materials, we have Baltic Dirty Tanker Index, and this one tracks the cost of transportation for crude oil. Baltic Clean Tanker Index tracks the transportation cost for movement of petroleum products like petrol, diesel, and so on. So these are some important global developments. Let's get into some specific problems faced by the economists, starting with Germany. Now, as far as Germany is concerned, Germany has faced contraction in its GDP for 2 consecutive years. And this is the second time where Germany has faced back-to-back contraction since 1950s. Prior to this, Germany had faced similar contraction in 2002 and 2003. So what actually happened with Germany? Germany, which was called as a kind of economic powerhouse of Europe, is now being labeled as sick man of Europe. It is being said that Germany has faced 4 shocks in the recent past. Because of these 4 shocks only, Germany has got into this kind of economic situation. What are these shocks? Let's understand these shocks one by one, starting with the energy shock. Now think of India. India imports almost 85% of its crude oil requirements from other countries. So naturally, if something happens in the Middle East, and if the international crude oil prices increase, it would have a large scale effect on the Indian economy. For example, our cost of production would increase. The reason being, crude oil is a critical input for India. Apart from that, the rupee value would undergo large scale depreciation. The cost of production would increase. Apply the same logic to Germany. Germany imports almost 55% of its natural gas requirements from Russia. When the Russia-Ukraine war started, the Western nations imposed sanctions on Russia, which made it difficult for Germany to source natural gas from Russia, and it had to find a alternate supplier, which is USA. Now, the thing is, because there was a shortage of natural gas in Germany, and natural gas being a critical input, the production cost in Germany skyrocketed. And if the production's costs increase, what will happen to profits of the companies? Profits of the companies would obviously reduce. So if you look at the German economy is dominated by automobile industries. So some of the famous global brands such as Volkswagen, Mercedes, BMW, they are basically German companies. The cost of production increased and it adversely affected their profits. Not just automobile industries, it also affected the chemical industries in Germany. So there is a chemical industry in Germany called as BASF. It is the world's largest chemicals manufacturer. Its profit shrunk because of this particular energy shock. The second problem is obviously the shock coming from Chinese economy. If you look at China, at the start of this particular century, China accounted for just 6% of the global manufacturing output. But it is being said that by 2040, China would account for almost 45% of global manufacturing output. In fact, Economic Survey mentions a very beautiful line. It says, in the war of production, even if all the countries come together, they cannot defeat China. That is the might of China when it comes to manufacturing. So what China has been doing is, because of its manufacturing strength, it has been flooding the European Union market with cheaper Chinese goods, including Chinese made cars. And this has adversely affected the German manufacturing companies. For example, the automobile sector in Germany account for almost 5% of Germany's GDP. So the biggest automobile brands of Germany are unable to face the intense competition from the cheaper Chinese cars. Apart from that, China has made rapid strides with respect to electric vehicles. But when you look at German companies like Volkswagen, Mercedes, their transition towards electric vehicle has been much slower. That is why Chinese car manufacturing companies have dominated the electric vehicle segment within EU, which has in turn adversely affected German economy. It has been said that Volkswagen, for the first time in the last 87 years, is planning to shut down 3 plants. In fact, some of the German companies are trying to relocate themselves to other countries. So amidst all of these problems like increase in production cost or intense competition from China, there is increase in unemployment, joblessness. So large number of people would be unemployed, and this can adversely affect the economy even further as well. The next problem is with respect to global shock. So Germany, just like China, is majorly dependent upon export of iron and steel and other products to countries, predominantly being US. So now US has threatened that it will increase the tariffs for the import of goods from Europe also, which is going to adversely affect Germany. Apart from that, because of geo-economic fragmentation that we discussed, Germany is finding it difficult to find markets at a global level. The next one is with respect to domestic shock. So like I said, because of that particular contraction, the consumer sentiment in Germany is at all-time low. People are not coming forward to spend for purchase of goods and services, which in turn is leading to fall in investment. Now think if the same thing happens in India, if there is lower demand for goods and services, what would the Indian government do? To increase the demand, the government would borrow more amount of money. By borrowing more amount of money, we will provide for fiscal stimulus. Naturally, don't you think even Germany should do the same thing? It should borrow more amount of money, pump in money so that the demand for goods and services increase. But in Germany, the problem is the German government has adopted debt brake rule, which puts a limit on borrowings. Like in India, we have FRBM Act, right, which puts a limit on government borrowings at 3% of GDP. Same way in Germany also, there's a limit on the government borrowings. In India, when COVID-19 pandemic happened, the finance minister was in a dilemma as to whether the government should borrow more or not. Because if the government borrows more, it could mean that government is letting go of FRBM Act, right? But the Indian economy needed to borrow more amount of money to provide fiscal stimulus. So finance minister decided that we will let go of the FRBM targets because our priority is to provide fiscal stimulus. That is what government did. Why is Germany not doing the same thing? The problem is in Germany, there was a coalition of three parties, and between these three parties, there was lack of consensus on whether we should break this particular debt brake rule or not. So sometimes political stability is quite important for an economy to come out of the economic crisis. So this political instability in Germany further prolonged the contraction. So this is a problem as far as Germany is concerned. How questions are likely to be asked? I'll show you when I take up practice questions. Now coming to real estate crisis in China. What is this real estate crisis? Until 2007-8, China basically relied on export-led model to grow and develop. But global financial crisis of 2007-8 was a major jolt to the Chinese economy. That is when China understood that it cannot rely only on export-led model. It had to find an alternatives as well. China had to look out for another sector which can help its economy to grow faster. And that particular sector which China found was real estate sector. Why only real estate sector? Why not other sectors? It is being said that the real estate sector has both backward linkages and forward linkages. Because of that backward and forward linkages, development of real estate sector will lead to development of entire economy. How so? Let's say there's a rapid development of real estate sector in the form of housing and commercial property. So real estate companies will make more investment. So because they're making more investment, they will demand for more raw materials like iron, steel, cement, electricity. So what is happening to these industries? These industries will also grow by making more amount of investment. So that is a backward linkage. Once new houses, new commercial properties constructed, it will improve the standard of living of people in China. So China thought that we will give a fillip to the real estate sector. By doing so, we can pull up the entire Chinese economy. Idea was great. Problem was in implementation. What actually happened in China was, in order to give a fillip to the real estate sector, China relied on giving excessive amount of credit to infrastructure companies as well as local government, which obviously led to rapid expansion of real estate sector, which helped in both backward and forward linkages. But the problem here was it led to large scale demand supply mismatch. As far as supply is concerned, the supply of housing property, commercial property drastically increased. As far as the demand is concerned, demand did not increase commensurately. Why? You know, China has been following one child policy. Because of that one child policy, the population growth rate in China has slowed down. If population growth rate slows down, obviously demand for housing property, commercial property will obviously slow down. So on one hand, supply increased while demand did not increase commensurately. What will happen to real estate prices? Real estate prices crashed. So as you can see in this particular image, in China, you'll come across large number of ghost apartments. Ghost apartments means empty homes, but no people to live in those homes. In one of the international media, I don't remember the newspaper, but it was mentioned that China has so many empty homes that the entire population of some of the smaller countries in Europe, they can be accommodated in these empty homes. That is the extent of oversupply of property in China. So because of oversupply, the prices crashed. Imagine we all are in China and we have invested in real estate. Prices have crashed. People will become nervous. People will become jittery that it may crash even further. What will people try to do? Even before it falls further, people will try to sell off their property. And if people try to sell off their property, what will happen to supply? Supply will further increase. Prices will further reduce. That is one part of the problem. There is another part of the problem also. Other part of problem is, understand, how did infrastructure companies and local government create all of that property? By borrowing. So unless they sell off this particular property, recover money, they will not be able to repay the loans. What if they don't repay the loans? It will have an adverse effect on the financial system of China. So the grave danger which China faces is the problem from real estate sector can spread to the financial sector. That is the biggest problem. So to ensure that China is able to come out of this real estate crisis faster, China has recently announced stimulus measures. The stimulus measures are basically to increase the demand. And the ways by which China is trying to increase the demand is by providing for cut in the interest rate so that the demand for housing property, commercial property increases, by giving subsidies to people to undertake more spending, and to improve the financial position of the banks. Chinese government is undertaking recapitalization of banks, that is infusing more capital into banks so that even if infrastructure companies default on repayment of loans, it should not have an adverse effect on the banking system. So this is the real estate crisis which is happening in China. Now the next one is with respect to end of negative interest rate in Japan. So here, as far as your prelims examination is concerned, you should know what exactly is this negative interest rate. For that, let me just give you the background. See, as far as Japan is concerned, we all know that because of the aging population, the demand in Japan economy has stagnated. Because of stagnation in demand, the Japan economy has been facing economic stagnation. So to increase the demand, to encourage the banks to give more amount of loans to the public, Japanese central bank adopted negative interest rate policy in the year 2016. What is this negative interest rate policy? Let's understand through a simple example. Let's say there is a commercial bank and this is Japan's central bank. This bank, let's say, deposit money with the central bank for few days. After the maturity of the deposit, the Japanese central bank will give back the deposits along with the interest, right? That is how it actually works. For example, in India, we have the similar tool, which is reverse repo, right? Reverse repo is a tool through which commercial banks keep surplus deposits with RBI, and on those deposits, RBI will pay a interest which is equal to reverse repo rate. Let's see the same manner. So let's assume, just for sake of simplification, reverse repo rate in Japan is equal to 3% plus 3%. What does it mean? If commercial bank in Japan deposits 100 yen with Japanese central bank will give back this 100 yen and interest of 3% on 100 yen, which is 3 yen. That is how the system would work. But imagine the interest rate which I'm talking about is not plus 3, it is rather, for example, minus 3. What happens if it is minus 3? Come back to this. Bank will deposit 100 yen with Japan Central Bank. Japanese Central Bank will pay back the deposit of 100 yen and it will pay a interest of not plus 3, no? It will pay a interest of minus 3. Minus 3 means how much money is Japan Central Bank giving to the commercial bank? 97 yen. So Japanese Central Bank is cutting the money if commercial bank is depositing some money with itself. That is what is called as negative interest rate policy. Why do you think it is adopted? Two reasons. Reason number one, to discourage the commercial banks to deposit money with Japanese Central Bank. Obviously, if bank is getting less amount of money from Japanese Central Bank, they'll not keep money with Central Bank. That is reason number one. Second, whatever surplus money they have, instead of keeping that in the form of deposits with Central Bank, that surplus money they should give out in the form of loans so that the demand in the Japanese economy increases. That is what is called as negative interest rate. So Japan was following this negative interest rate policy from 2016 onwards. But as you can see, in March 2024, finally Japan has bid a farewell to negative interest rate policy. What's the reason for that? The reason is quite simple. Now the rate of inflation in Japan is increasing. There are multiple reasons why rate of inflation is increasing. Reason number one, over a period of time, because of easy money policy followed by Japanese central bank, the supply of yen has increased. If supply of yen increases, obviously more money with the people, demand may increase. That is reason number one. Reason number two, Japanese companies have been paying more wages to the Japanese employees. More wages means more disposable income. More disposable income means more demand. But there's something more significant for this rise in inflation. You all know that dollar value has been rapidly increasing at a global level. Dollar is rapidly appreciating. If dollar appreciates, what will happen to Japanese yen? Japanese yen will obviously depreciate. In fact, it is said that in last 1.5 years, Japanese yen has depreciated by almost 20%. Now, because of depreciation of Japanese yen, think if Japan is importing something from other countries, its currency has undergone depreciation. What will happen to imports in Japan? Imports, because of depreciation of yen, imports into Japan will become more costly, and this will further lead to inflation. So there are multiple reasons why inflation is taking place. These are some of the reasons. So because of these reasons, Japan has finally decided to end the negative interest rate policy. Let's move to the next development. The next development is with respect to dollarization. What is this dollarization? The Argentina has been facing hyperinflation from 1.5 years. Because of that hyperinflation, generally what will economists do to counter inflation? They will increase the policy rates, or the government will undertake fiscal consolidation measures. This is what generally economists would do. But Argentina has taken a very radical step to control hyperinflation. Argentina has decided to replace its domestic currency peso with dollar. That we call it as dollarization. So Argentina believes that replacement of domestic currency with dollar will ultimately help Argentina to control inflation. How will it lead to controlling inflation? Let's understand this through a flowchart. See, right now, there is excessive supply of peso in domestic market. More supply means more demand. More demand means hyperinflation. So how is dollarization, switch from peso to dollar, going to solve this problem? Now what will happen is, because there is excess supply of peso in the domestic market, Argentina has said that will shift to dollars. What will people do? People will convert their peso into dollars at a current exchange rate, that is $1 is equal to 60 peso. If I have 60 peso, I'll convert this into $1. If you have 120 peso, you'll get $2. So upon conversion, can I say that people would have less money, in this case dollars, to purchase goods? If they have less dollars to purchase goods, ultimately in the short run, it is going to reduce the demand and hence control inflation. That is how inflation can be controlled in the short run. In the long run, the hyperinflation takes place because central banks of a country can print unlimited domestic currency, which has happened in other countries such as Zimbabwe. But if a country switches from domestic currency to dollar, can it print dollar? It cannot print dollar. It has to obtain dollar. It has to get dollar. And how can it get dollar? By exporting goods, services to other countries. So in order to get dollar, it has to export more goods and services, it has to make more investment, and in doing so, the GDP of a country will come back to normalcy. That is the basic idea here. And let me tell you, it is not just Argentina which has gone for dollarization. Other countries include Ecuador, Panama, and El Salvador. Even these countries have also gone for dollarization. Let's take up the practice questions now. Germany has overtaken Japan to become the third largest economy in the world. Obviously, this statement is correct. There has been rapid GDP growth in Germany in the last 2 years due to proactive government policies. This is incorrect. At the start of our discussion, I told you that in spite of contraction in its GDP, Germany has overtaken Japan. This is very interesting. Why it has taken place? Let's understand this through an example. So generally, what happens is every country, they will measure their GDP in their domestic currencies. For example, India would measure its GDP in terms of rupees. Japan would measure its GDP in terms of yen. Germany would measure its GDP in terms of euro. Now the problem here is because the countries are measuring GDP in their own currencies, it becomes quite difficult to compare the GDP sizes of these countries. For example, I can't compare Indian GDP with Japanese GDP because the currencies happens to be different. So how can we compare the the GDP size? By converting the GDP size of the countries into one common currency. Obviously, that common currency happens to be dollar, right? So, for example, let's talk about India. In the year 2023, let's say in the year 2023, our GDP size was equal to rupees 100, and the exchange rate was $1 is equal to rupees 100. It is just an example. So what will be India's GDP in terms of US dollar? In terms of US dollar, our GDP would be $1. Now what is interesting is when you measure India's GDP as $1, there are two factors which determine India's GDP in terms of dollar. One, what is our GDP size in terms of rupees? But there is another thing also which determines this, which is exchange rate. And it is being said that this exchange rate can play a very dominant role in understanding or in determining the GDP size of a country in terms of dollar. For example, if GDP in terms of domestic currency remains same, for example, but if exchange rate appreciates, then GDP in terms of US dollar would increase. On the other hand, if exchange rate undergoes depreciation, GDP in terms of US dollar would reduce. Complicated? Let's simplify this through an example. Let's say in the year 2024, our GDP has just remained same, just to keep it simple. And the exchange rate, for example, is $1 is equal to 50. Now, in this particular situation, what has happened to value of rupee? value of rupee in this particular case has undergone appreciation. And if it has undergone appreciation, now what is India's GDP in terms of dollar? India's GDP in terms of dollar is 2. What has happened? It has increased, right? On the other hand, let's see another scenario. Let's say our GDP remains 100 only, but $1 is now equal to rupees 200. It means rupee has undergone depreciation. So what will be our GDP size in this case? Our GDP size is $0.5. So if the domestic currency undergoes depreciation, GDP of a country will be lower, right? I can extend the same logic to Japan as well. What has happened to Japan's economy? Japan's economy, as you know, has remained stagnant. In a way, broadly, the GDP of Japan in terms of yen has mostly remained same. When I say mostly remained same, means there is small increase in GDP, let's say 0.2%, which is quite insignificant. But like I told you, in last 1.5 years, what has happened to Japanese yen? Japanese yen has undergone depreciation by almost 20%. So when you compare the GDP size of Japan, convert from yen to dollar, the dollar value that you will get is less. So it is not that Germany has grown. Rather, I would say in terms of measurement, when you convert yen into dollar, because the yen value has depreciated, Japan's GDP size in terms of dollar has got reduced, and that is why Germany has overtaken Japan. Hope it's clear, right? This is quite interesting. So you should know how fluctuations in exchange rate will also determine the GDP size of a particular country. Sometimes it is not just depend upon how much goods, how much services we produce. It is also based upon the exchange rate also. Let's look at the next practice question. Japan has recently ended its negative interest rate policy, which is right. Negative interest rate policy is adopted to counter rising inflation, which is incorrect, because negative interest rate policy is adopted to counter deflation, economic stagnation. Look at this practice question. Replacing domestic currency with dollar can help economy to combat hyperinflation. Yes, there is a possibility that it can counter hyperinflation. Dollarization gives more freedom to central bank in formulation of monetary policy. Imagine in case of Argentina, it has switched from peso to dollar. Will it give more freedom to Argentinian central bank to formulate monetary policy? I don't think so. The reason is pretty simple. It is quite easier for Argentinian central bank to control the supply of peso, because peso happens to be its own domestic currency. But it's quite difficult for Argentina central bank to control the amount of dollars. So in a way, the Argentinian central bank has given up its freedom in formulation of monetary policy. That is why this statement is incorrect. So in both the cases, the right answer is C. Now coming to the last development at a global level. You can see here, recently it has been reported in various newspapers that the bond yields in most of the global economies have been increasing. So if you see, bond yields in US, UK, Japan have increased to almost decade high. You can see in US, the bond yield in Jan 2025 had reached 4.73%, which is considered to be highest since 2007. Same can be said about Japan as well as UK. Why is it interesting? It is interesting because if you see, bond yield is directly proportional to rate of interest. When I say directly proportional to rate of interest means if rate of interest increases, bond yield will also increase. If rate of interest reduces, bond yield will also reduce, right? Now think what is happening in all of these advanced economies, particularly US and UK. Let's keep aside Japan. In these countries, the rate of interest has been reducing, right? So you know that US Fed Bank has decided to pump in dollars by cutting down interest rates. So decrease in rate of interest, especially in US, should lead to fall in bond yield. But rather than decrease in bond yields are actually increasing in US economy, as you can very well see. Now this is what is interesting. Why is this happening? We will understand. China is facing a problem of its own. You can see in China, bond yields are reducing. So in China, bond yields have come to all-time low of almost 1.65%. So what are the factors which are affecting the bond yield? That becomes quite important. For example, you can see in prelims 2021, you had this particular question about what are the factors affecting the bond yields in India. Similarly, let's get into this particular discussion. Okay. See, what I want to tell you is when you look at bond yields in a particular country, it is determined by multiple factors. One of which is rate of interest, which I discussed. Apart from rate of interest, bond yield is also determined by rate of inflation. It is also determined by borrowings of the government. So you should look at the net effect of all these three factors, that is rate of interest, inflation and borrowings, to understand how the bond yields will get affected, whether the bond yields will increase or decrease. You can't just look at one single factor of rate of interest. So most of you must be thinking the rate of interest, if it has got reduced, bond yield should have also got reduced. But bond yield is increasing because what are about the other factors? Government borrowings as well as inflation. Probably they are increasing, and that is why the combined effect of these two is more than fall in interest rate, and that is why bond yields are increasing. Let's understand this through a flowchart. Number one, how bond yields are affected by central bank policies. Let's see here. Let's say central bank is following expansionary policy. As the name suggests, expansionary, we are pumping in money. And to pump in money, central bank is purchasing more bonds. If I am the central bank, if I am purchasing more bonds from the investors, there are two possibilities. One, demand for the bonds is increasing, or supply of the bonds is reducing. If demand increases, supply reduces, what will happen to bond price? Bond price will increase. Bond yield, please remember, is always inversely proportional to bond price. So bond yield will reduce. So expansionary policy means rate of interest is reducing, bond yield is also reducing. Same logic you have to apply to contractionary policy. So central bank is sucking out money. To suck out money, it is selling bonds. If it sells bond, the demand for bonds is reducing, supply of bonds is increasing, bond prices will reduce, bond yields will increase. You can look at this particular diagram. How inflation affects the bond yield? Let's understand. Let's say I am a bond investor. I have invested in the bond. And on the bonds, I am getting regular interest, right? I'm getting regular interest, but the prices of goods and services are increasing. So there's a problem that even though prices of goods and services are increasing, the amount of interest which I am getting, that remains same. So what happens to the purchasing power of that interest that I'm earning? The purchasing power of the interest which I'm earning will decrease, no? Because the prices of goods and services are increasing. That is one way. Second, when the bond matures, upon the maturity of the bond, I'll get back the principal amount. But what if the prices of goods and services have increased? The principal amount which I'm getting back would remain same. What has happened to that principal amount? The purchasing power of that principal amount has got reduced. So I, as a bond holder, you must understand, will lose out because the interest that I'm getting and the principal amount that I'll get upon the redemption of bond, that will remain same, but prices of goods and services have increased. The bondholder will obviously lose out during inflation. If I lose out during inflation, should I stay invested in bond? Should I buy bond? Obviously not. In fact, if I am expecting that in future rate of inflation is going to increase, even in that case also I'll not purchase bond, because in future also I'll make loss. So generally during inflation, it is bad to invest in bond, right? So whenever there's an inflation, interest earned and principal remains same despite rising prices, bond holders lose out, demand for bonds reduce, bond prices will reduce, and bond yields will increase. As the rate of inflation increases, bond yields will also increase. This side, if rate of inflation reduces, the bond yields will also reduce. What about government borrowings? How does government borrow money? Government borrows money by issuing bonds, right? Think of it, government is borrowing more amount of money. To borrow more amount of money, government will issue more bonds. If government issues more bonds, what will happen to supply of bonds? Supply of bonds will increase. If supply of bond increases, what will happen to bond price? Bond price will reduce. What will happen to bond yield? Bond yield is inversely proportional to bond price. Bond yield will increase, right? Same way, if there is decrease in borrowings of the government, bond yields will also decrease. So, yes, central banks have reduced the interest rate. Because of decrease in interest rate, bond yields should reduce. But why is bond yield increasing? Reason is very simple, because bond yield is not just determined by rate of interest, it is also determined by inflation as well as government borrowings. Let's start from there. Government borrowings. What has US done? US has announced tax cuts, right? It has announced cut in the tax rate. Because of tax cut, what will happen to receipts of the US government? Receipts of the US government will reduce. If the receipts reduce, what will happen to borrowings of the US government? Borrowings to increase hoga na. So if the borrowings of US government increases, what will happen? Bond yields in US would increase. This is one way to look at it. Another thing, now inflation in US has got stabilized, no doubt about it. But what about future? I told you, Trump has decided to increase the import duty, custom duty on import of goods into US economy. If custom duty increases, what will happen to import of goods into US? Import of goods into US will become more costly. And if it becomes costly, it will lead to increase in inflation in future. So I told you, bondholders will not just look at the present rate of inflation, bondholders will also look at the future rate of inflation. So if in future, if the inflation rate is going to be higher, they're going to lose out. So if inflation increases, what will happen to bond yield? Bond yield will also increase, right? Think about Japan. In Japan, what is happening is inflation rate has increased, bond yields will also increase. So these are some of the reasons as to why the bond yields are increasing despite the rate cuts by the central banks. How can you get a question on this? Let's look at this particular question. Practice MCQ. In the recent past, there has been a rise in the bond yields in many advanced economies. In the recent past, similar to this question, in the post-pandemic recent past means you have to see the year 2024, right? Which is obviously correct. Central banks in the advanced economies have undertaken rate cuts in the recent past, which is also correct. But the problem here is the second statement explaining the first statement? Let's add the word because after the first statement, and let's see, is the second statement explaining the first statement. In the recent past, bond yields in advanced economies have increased because central banks have undertaken rate cuts. If central bank have undertaken rate cuts, what should have happened to bond yield? Bond yield should have got reduced, right? So this does not explain the first statement. So right answer in this particular case is B. Both statement 1 and statement 2 are correct, and statement 2 does not explain the first statement correctly. This is about the developments in the global economy. Now coming to the next topic of geo-economic fragmentation. So what do you mean by geo-economic fragmentation? According to economic survey, geo-economic fragmentation can be defined as reversal in the global economic integration due to geopolitical as well as political considerations. So if there is restriction in terms of free flow of trade, investment, people, because of geopolitical problems, geostrategic reasons, then we can call it as geo-economic fragmentation. So let's get into the details of what exactly is this geo-economic fragmentation, how it is getting caused, and all these things. For that, let's look at a parameter called as trade openness. Trade openness can be calculated as total sum of exports plus imports as percentage of GDP. So if you convert export plus imports into percentage of GDP, what you get is trade openness, which is important for your prelims examination. So let's see what has happened to trade openness of the global economy. So during industrialization, as you can see, there was more trade openness, that is free flow of goods, which actually got reduced during the First World War as well as Second World War. But after the Second World War, because of formation of international institutions like IMF, World Bank, as well as signing of multilateral agreement, that is GATT, the trade openness started increasing. Further, somewhere around 1980s, it started increasing even further. The reason being, most of the countries, they adopted liberalization. Think of countries such as China, India, etc. Because of adoption of liberalization, there was more trade openness. Another reason why the trade openness further increased is because in 1995, the World Trade Organization was established. But in the last decade or so, can you see there has been almost stagnation in the trade openness. So This particular stagnation in trade openness means there are restrictions with respect to movement of imports and exports. So this is an example of geo-economic fragmentation. In fact, the economic survey makes a very beautiful statement. It says the promise of shared benefits from a globalized world with open trade, free flow of capital and technology may be behind us. That is, India can no longer rely on the global economy to become a Viksit Bharat. That is why I told you at the start of a discussion that Indian economy has to focus more on the domestic levers, that is the domestic factors. So based upon the discussion that we are going to have with respect to geo-economic fragmentation, a question that can be expected in your mains examination could be something like this. What do you mean by geo-economic fragmentation? Discuss the challenges and strategies to be adopted by India to deal with geo-economic fragmentation. So let's get into the discussion of geo-economic fragmentation. So the definition is reversal of global economic integration due to strategic and geopolitical considerations, wherein this particular phenomena is characterized by restrictions on trade. This can be seen in case of US-China trade war or threat of reciprocal tariff being proposed by the Trump administration, or the sanctions imposed by Western countries on Russia, which has reduced the trade openness at a global level. Second, there are restrictions on free flow of capital also, which can be seen in terms of restrictions by US economy on Chinese investment. And we can also see that restrictions imposed by Indian economy on Chinese investment as well. So if you look at our FDI policy, right? In our FDI policy, the government has said FDI from a country with which India shares border shall come only through the government route, that is approval route. So obviously we are targeting which country here? China. The third restriction can be seen in terms of reorganization of supply chains. For example, it can be seen in terms of China plus one strategy. What is this China plus one strategy? See, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the dominance of China in the global supply chains. And it has showed that if we rely too much on one single country for supply of critical products, critical components, the entire supply chain would get disrupted. For example, the same thing happened during COVID-19 pandemic, where China was following zero COVID policy, due to which China imposed complete lockdown. And because China was not manufacturing critical components, it adversely affected all other countries as well. So now the countries have realized that they cannot rely only on one single country, which is China, as part of supply chain. They need to diversify away from China. So that we call it as China plus one strategy. To further get into this dominance of China, the economic survey this year has pointed out that China controls almost 80% of solar panel cell manufacturing. It controls almost 80% of manufacturing of electric batteries. It controls 70% of rare earth minerals. It also controls more than 50% of important reserves like lithium, cobalt, and so on. So, the global economy is trying to shift to clean energy, which requires us to produce more electric vehicles, which requires us to focus more on renewable energy. But the problem is electric batteries, renewable energy capacity is mostly concentrated in China, right? So it is like saying the global economy's transition to clean energy is dependent on one country alone, which is China. So there is a need for China plus one strategy. And this strategy can be seen in case of US, where US government has come up with Inflation Reduction Act. The basic idea of Inflation Reduction Act is to reduce the prices of electric vehicles, electric batteries, renewable energy components such as solar panel cells. So we want to reduce the prices of these components. That is why it is titled as Inflation Reduction Act. But how can we reduce the prices? What US government is doing? US government is offering more subsidies to its companies to manufacture electric components, solar panel cells in its own country rather than manufacturing them in China. So this is leading to the reorganization of supply chains. In fact, in last year's budget, I had discussed the concept of near shoring as well as friend shoring. This is what is happening with respect to global supply chains. In EU, the EU has come up with CHIPS Act in order to reduce the dependence on countries such as Taiwan and Malaysia for semiconductors and to give a fillip to the manufacturing of semiconductor within EU. Same way, countries such as India, Japan and Australia, they have come up with their own initiative called as Supply Chain Resilience Initiative to reduce the dominance of China in the supply chain. So the supply chain is getting reorganized along the geopolitical lines. So more than economic efficiency, what is determining the supply chain now? It is determined by geostrategic considerations. There has been rising protectionism, which is evident in America First policy, as well as China's dual circulation strategy. So countries are becoming more inward. Countries are more focusing within their domestic economy and less on the global economy. For example, China, which was so far focusing on export-led model, more of outward, China has now decided that it will go for dual circulation strategy. Dual in this case means it will focus on domestic economy as well as global economy, which gives the word dual circulation. And some of the drivers as to why the geo-economic fragmentation is taking place, the factors. You can see the factors here: COVID-19 pandemic, geopolitical tensions like US-China trade war, Russia-Ukraine conflict, rise of economic nationalism, or weakening of multilateral institutions such as WTO. For example, the dispute settlement mechanism under WTO has become defunct and it is not capable enough to handle the trade disputes. So in the wake of geo-economic fragmentation that we are witnessing, what are India's challenges and how we should deal with those challenges? Before that, let me tell you, IMF has carried out a detailed study of the impact of geo-economic fragmentation on the countries. Depending upon how well a country is integrated into global economy, IMF has said that the country can face a loss ranging from 0.2 to 7% of GDP, depending upon how well it is integrated into global economy. So obviously that is a threat for Indian economy. So what are the challenges for the Indian economy? Number one, obviously fall in global trade. So with respect to fall in global trade, problem number one is, if you look at exports of India, already our exports are quite less. And we all know that India is majorly a importing country, right? Now the problem could further get accentuated because our exports could very well reduce. And this could have an adverse impact on some of the export driven industries like IT, BPO, or for that matter, steel. Take for example, EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism could have an adverse effect on our steel manufacturing. Same way, because of inward oriented policies of the governments, uh, it might become quite difficult for India to get access to critical raw materials such as semiconductors, rare earth minerals, and so on. So these are the strategies that we must follow. That is, we must go for diversification of trade in terms of both destination as well as products. So we need to ensure that we are exporting not to just few countries. We must focus on exporting to large number of countries so that India's vulnerability to geo-economic fragmentation reduces. We must secure energy deal, especially with the countries which have critical minerals like Chile, Australia, Argentina, etc. And ultimately, I think India must realize that for critical technology, we have to look more inward now. We have to develop our own indigenous technology. We have done it with respect to vaccines. We can do the same thing with other critical products as well going forth. And that is should be India's strategy. Next one is with respect to restriction on cross-border labor, a movement of labor. Now, this could have an adverse effect in terms of opportunities for Indians who go abroad to work in other countries such as US. This could affect the profits of IT companies because of restrictions on H1B visa, and the remittances coming into India might get affected. How to deal with this particular problem? You must understand, as far as Indian IT companies are concerned, Indian IT companies are focusing more on traditional services like development of software or export of human resources to the Western countries. This is a time where IT companies have to change their working model, where they should no longer rely on traditional services like software. It's a time where IT companies should shift to high value services like artificial intelligence, big data, machine learning, Internet of Things, and so on. Next one, we have to renegotiate FTAs with other countries so that India's advantage in terms of labor force is taken care of. So by renegotiating FTAs, we must ensure that we are able to provide for easier movement of Indian professionals into other countries. Next, we need to find alternate markets, especially for our labor. If US is putting restrictions in terms of H1B visa, we can probably explore alternatives such as Canada and Mexico. What I have done basically, in the same way, I have highlighted other challenges in terms of cross-border capital flow, international payment system, forex reserves, and global public goods. I hope you should be able to go through this, understand the challenges faced by India, and what should India deal with those, how should India deal with those challenges. They are pretty self-explanatory. You should be able to go through this and understand. Now let's understand the approach to answer writing. Look at this question. This question has basically three parts. First part, the meaning of geo-economic fragmentation. Second part, challenges. Third part is strategies. So when it comes to introduction, the introduction could start with the meaning of geo-economic fragmentation and its characteristics. Remember, we discussed the characteristic, that is restriction on trade, restriction on investment, restriction on movement of labor, right? So those characteristics you can write in your introduction. So you can see geo-economic fragmentation, the meaning, and this shift is characterized by trade restriction, capital flow restriction, reorganization of supply chain, and rising protectionism. And please give some examples also. As far as the body of the answer is concerned, you need to focus on challenges and strategies. But before directly jumping into challenges and strategies, what you can do, you could incorporate a diagram, a hub and spoke diagram, which explains the factors leading to geo-economic fragmentation, which we have discussed, like COVID-19 pandemic, the Russia, the sanctions on Russia, right? So those factors you can incorporate. And the part 2 of the answer, you can incorporate challenges and strategies in a tabular format. So after writing the body of the answer, next is conclusion. So what is way ahead? As far as the way ahead is concerned, you can directly take into account the recommendations made by this year's economic survey, which is that India can no longer rely on the shared prosperity through free movement of goods, capital, and technology. India should start focusing more on domestic levers or domestic factors. So that is what is the economic survey recommendation. As highlighted by economic survey, the promise of shared benefits from globalized world with open trade, free flow of capital and technology may be behind us. Hence, India needs to focus on domestic levers to become Viksit Bharat by 2047. This is how you could write an answer to this particular question. Now let's get into the next part of the discussion, which is with respect to what is the trends in India's GDP, trends in GDP growth rate, trends in terms of consumption expenditure, investment rate, which are generally important as far as your prelims exam is concerned. Just have a look at the previous year questions related to GDP or national income. Questions are generally asked with respect to, as you can see, sectors of economy, types of capital, concept of real sector, then trends in GDP, capital output ratio. These are the questions which are generally asked. So based upon the nature of questions asked in prelims, let's get into the discussion one by one, and then we'll simultaneously be taking up the practice questions as well. Just have a look at the trend in real GDP and nominal GDP in absolute value. In Jan 2025, the National Statistical Office has published the estimates of national income for the year 24-25. According to NSO, the nominal GDP of India has increased to 324 lakh crores. That is the GDP at current market prices. The real GDP, which is GDP at base year price, is somewhere around 185 lakh crores. That is the total value of GDP in terms of absolute value. And if you look at the GDP growth rate for the year 24-25, NSO says the GDP is expected to grow at 6.4, and the real GDP is expected to grow at 6.4 and nominal GDP at 9.7. And please observe the general trends. The GDP growth rate, you don't see a particular trend of consistent increase or consistent decrease, which I would say is good for you because you don't have to mug up whether they are consistently increasing or decreasing. Overall GDP growth rate has been fluctuating. Next is with respect to sectors of economy. This was a question, remember, which was asked in prelims 2024. This question. So let's see what are the sectors of economy. National Statistical Office categorizes the sectors of economy into three types: primary sector, secondary sector, and tertiary sector. Primary sector basically includes those sectors wherein we are directly dependent upon the nature. So all of that sector will be based in called as primary sector. Examples include agriculture, livestock, forestry, fishing, mining, and quarrying. Please understand, mining and quarrying is also part of the primary sector, and it's not secondary sector. Secondary sector in India includes manufacturing, electricity, gas, water supply, and other utility services, and construction. What is interesting is, even though we say gas, water supply, and other utility services, we don't include it in tertiary sector. It is part of secondary sector, right? And construction, please remember, it is part of secondary sector. So construction is basically where processing takes place or manufacturing of finished product takes place. So in terms of construction, what we do, we have raw materials like iron, steel, bricks. All of these raw materials are in turn processed into a building, right? So that is why it becomes part of secondary sector. Tertiary sector includes trade, hotel, transport, communication, financial service, real estate service, professional service, and so on. Presently, if you see the share of different sectors to India's GVA, that is gross value addition, primary sector accounts for almost 20%, secondary sector is almost like 25%, and tertiary sector is somewhere around 55%. That is the share of different sectors to India's economy. Even though the graph here does not show the contribution of agriculture sector to India's GVA, please remember one thing, that in last 1 decade, the share of agriculture sector to India's GVA has remained almost stagnant at 18%. Only during COVID, there was slight increase in the share of agriculture sector, but otherwise, share of agriculture sector has mostly remained stagnant in last 1 decade. As far as manufacturing sector share is concerned, the share of manufacturing sector to India's GVA has once again remained stagnant between 14 to 17% since 1991. So that is the trend in terms of contribution of manufacturing sector. And if you see the contribution in terms of subsectors, please have a look at this. The subsector which contributes highest to India's GVA is actually financial, real estate, and professional services. This contributes highest, and this is actually followed by agriculture, livestock, and fishing, which is 18%. This is something which is important for your prelims examination. Look at that question asked in prelims 2024. Storage of agricultural produce is actually part of tertiary sector. It is not part of secondary sector. Dairy farm is part of primary sector. Mineral exploration is part of primary sector. Weaving cloth, because you're processing something, it becomes part of secondary sector, right? So storage is tertiary, dairy farm is primary, mineral is primary, weaving cloth is secondary. So the answer in this case is only 2. Just like how in previous year prelims, question has been asked with respect to primary, secondary, and tertiary. Question can also be asked with respect to organized and unorganized sector. So let's understand what is organized and unorganized sector in India, because it is quite confusing for most of the students. Okay. With respect to what exactly is unorganized sector, even though you'll come across different definitions in different sources, you must understand that the definition of unorganized sector has been given in the Unorganized Workers Act. So we have a separate act. In this particular act, there is a definition of unorganized sector. What is that definition? Unorganized sector is basically an enterprise which is owned by individuals or self-employed workers where number of workers is less than 10. So what is important is the number of workers in the unorganized enterprise is below 10. That is very important. So it is not based upon whether the enterprise is registered or not. The difference is based upon the number of workers in a particular enterprise. So what will be organized enterprise then? The best way to know organized enterprise is any enterprise which is not unorganized becomes a organized enterprise, right? Apart from that, the workers, as you know, they are also categorized as organized workers and unorganized workers, or you can categorize them as formal workers and informal workers. On what basis are the workers categorized as formal and informal? Let's understand this as well. See, basically, a formal worker is someone who is given protection under various social security acts. For example, if the worker has got social security like insurance, pension, provident fund, if worker has access to these social security schemes, then we can call such a worker as formal worker. If a worker does not has benefits of social security and is not protected under various acts, that is under, let's say, Employee Provident Fund Act or Employee State Insurance Act, if they are not recognized under those acts which provide for insurance, pension, and so on, we can call such workers as informal workers. Within the organized sector, you will come across both formal workers as well as informal workers. Formal workers will have benefit of social security like insurance, pension under the act of the parliament like Employee Provident Fund Act, Employee State Insurance Act, and so on. Informal workers do not get these benefits. Mostly these workers are contractual workers. They're working on a contractual basis. They are not permanent employees. Because they're not permanent employees, they do not get these kind of social security benefits. So in the unorganized sector also we'll get formal worker and informal worker. I'm pretty sure most of you must be thinking that we understand informal workers in unorganized sector, but how come we could have formal workers in unorganized sector? So let's say there's an unorganized enterprise. This enterprise has less than 10 workers, but it could so happen that in that particular enterprise there could be a supervisor. That supervisor may be permanent employee of that particular enterprise, and that supervisor might be having access to social security benefits under EPF, Employee Provident Fund, or they might be having benefit under Employee State Insurance Corporation. The number will obviously be very less, but still you would find such people even in the unorganized enterprise also. So based upon this, this is the table which highlights the formal and informal workers in the organized and unorganized sector. I have taken this particular table directly from PLFS report, Periodic Labor Force Survey report. So based upon this, let's see where are the majority of the workers employed in India. So as you can see, 82% of the workers are employed in the unorganized sector and 18% of the workers are employed in the organized sector. Within the unorganized sector, you have 98% of workers who are informal and just 1.8% of formal workers. However, within the organized sector, 53% of workers are formal workers and 47% of the workers are informal workers. And broadly, if I want to know what is the percentage share of formal and informal workers in India, this is what you will get. So the share of formal workers, you can say in India is hardly around, I would say around 10%. Informal workers is around 90%. So almost 90% of workers in India are actually informal workers. So this is how you can know about categorization of sectors into organized and unorganized sector. Let's look at this practice question. The share of manufacturing sector to India's GVA has increased in the last decade. Like I said, it has remained stagnant at 14 to 17%. It has not increased. There has been increase in the manufacturing sector output since the launch of Make in India in 2014. Yes. When I say output, in terms of absolute value, the manufacturing output has increased. There's no doubt about it. But if you convert that absolute value into percentage of GDP, that has remained stagnant in the range of 14 to 17, because you must understand our GDP has also increased by much higher value, right? So that is why the first statement is incorrect, but the second statement is correct. With respect to trends in contribution of different sectors, consider the following statement. The share of agriculture sector to India's GVA has gradually reduced in the last decade. It has remained stagnant. Share of services sector has increased to more than 50%. Correct. Trade, hotel, transport and communication accounts for highest share. No, it is actually, like I said, financial sector. Financial sector accounts for the highest share. So the right answer in this case is 2 only. Last, presently there is no legal definition of unorganized worker. There is a legal definition as we discussed. Unorganized worker include only those workers who are working in unregistered enterprises. It is wrong. The reason being, unorganized worker also work in the organized sector. All the workers in the unorganized sector are always considered as informal workers. No, even within the unorganized sector, you'll come across formal workers. So right answer. Okay, here the answer is none of the above. So none of the statements are actually correct. Let's move to the next part. So we know that if you want to calculate GDP by expenditure method, we take into account 4 factors. That is PFC, government final consumption expenditure, gross capital formation, and net exports. Net exports is calculated as exports minus imports. So if you see exports minus imports, if you add the trade openness of India, as we covered before, trade openness is measured as exports plus imports as percentage of GDP. It is coming out to be almost 46%. But net exports, which is calculated as exports minus imports, it comes out to be minus 2%. It means trade, that is net exports, rather than aiding or helping the Indian economy to grow, it is pulling down Indian economy because India is a net importing country. And if you look at the other three drivers, the major driver of Indian economy happens to be private final consumption expenditure, accounting for almost 61% of India's GDP. So these are some of the things which you should know from the perspective of prelims. Next, let's see what has happened with respect to the contribution of PFCE in the India's GDP. You can see almost a decade back, private final consumption expenditure used to account for somewhere around 56% of GDP. From 56%, there has been increase in our private final consumption expenditure in the last decade, and it has now increased to somewhere around 61%. So please know the general trend in terms of PFCE. Let's look at this particular practice question here. Which among the following are included in private final consumption expenditure in India? Private final consumption expenditure is basically the money which is spent by people on purchase of goods and services. So what is included and what is excluded? Let's understand this thing. Farmer producing rice for consumption by his family. Now this is something which is interesting. Please know that if certain goods are bought by the household, it will be accounted under consumption expenditure. But if a household is purchasing goods for its self-consumption, even those goods are also accounted under PFC, private final consumption expenditure. This is quite interesting, so remember this. Money spent by the government to provide free food grains to the poor. Obviously, it's an expenditure, no doubt about it. But is it an expenditure by the households or is it expenditure by the government? It is expenditure by the government, right? So it will not get accounted in the household expenditure. Money spent by the company on purchase of machinery. If the company is purchasing machinery, it is not consumption expenditure. Rather, it will be called as gross capital formation, investment. So even this will also not be included. Money spent by NGO to provide free healthcare. So understand that whenever we say private final consumption expenditure, it is the expenditure incurred by both households as well as non-profit institutions, that is NGOs. Even the expenditure incurred by NGOs, even though they are not actually households, is still accounted under private final consumption expenditure. So the right answer in this case is 1 and 4 only. Those of you who would want to know details as to what is included and what is excluded in private final consumption expenditure, you can just look at this particular mind map in which I have highlighted what is included and what is excluded. In fact, I do remember I have covered this topic in detail in the previous budget and economic survey discussion. Now coming to the recent development, that is household consumption expenditure survey, which was recently published in December 2024. See, what had happened was with respect to household consumption expenditure survey, it was published for the last year, that is for the year 22-23. It was published last year. And this year, now there is another consumption expenditure survey for the year 23-24. This household consumption expenditure survey is published by NSO, National Statistical Office. In this particular survey, NSO is trying to find out how much money are the households spending कितना पैसा खर्च हो रहा है, both in rural areas as well as urban areas. Not just how much money is spent, NSO also tries to find out as to where the money is spent, whether the money is spent on food or non-food. Now, this particular survey is important because we will get to know the total money spent by the households and how the trend in consumption expenditure is changing over a period of time. And this particular survey might be used to uh, add the weightage while calculating CPI, Consumer Price Index. So, in CPI, we measure inflation in food and beverages, fuel and power, clothing, etc. So we assign weightage to these commodities based upon how much percentage of money people are spending on these commodities. So based upon that, we can assign the weightage, right? So let's understand the trend in terms of consumption expenditure. First one, as you can see, according to latest household consumption expenditure survey for the year 23-24, the average consumption expenditure in both rural as well as urban areas has increased as compared to previous year. This is first thing that you should know, that the consumption expenditure has increased. Second change is, which is quite significant, the percentage of money spent on food has got reduced and percentage of money spent on non-food has increased. Can you see the household expenditure survey for the year 2011-12, where 53% of money was spent on food and 47% money was spent on non-food. But last two surveys have shown that consumption on non-food has increased to more than 50% and consumption on food has reduced to below 50%. So this is quite significant, and this may require changes in the weightage that we assign to food and beverages in CPI. This has to change in future. With respect to urban areas also, can you see the weightage has got changed now, where in urban areas households are spending less on food and more on non-food. And if you rank different states in terms of their monthly per capita consumption expenditure, Sikkim is highest in both urban and rural areas, and Chhattisgarh is lowest in both urban and rural areas. The most important thing, both from prelims and mains, is we are witnessing a shift in consumption pattern in India. One particular shift I have already discussed, where the expenditure on food has got reduced while expenditure on non-food has increased. But can you see the second one? Within food, people's expenditure on cereals has reduced and people's expenditure on processed foods has increased. Highest expenditure is now incurred on beverages, refreshment, and processed food, followed by milk. And as far as non-food is concerned, highest expenditure is on conveyance, that is transportation. Finally, there is an index called as Gini coefficient. Gini coefficient is an index which is used to measure inequality in a country. Gini coefficient can also measure the inequality in terms of consumption. All of you know inequality in terms of income, that is how much income are households earning. Same way, we can measure inequality in terms of consumption also, right? So if you look at the inequality in terms of consumption, that is expenditure, the survey has pointed out that Gini coefficient has reduced. Reduced Gini coefficient means that the inequality in terms of consumption has got reduced. And if you want to know more details about Gini coefficient, I had covered this in the previous budget interim budget. So you can go through this. I'll put the link in the description box below. You can understand what exactly is Gini coefficient. Let's look at the practice question. Please try to read through the practice question, and based upon that, you can solve the practice question. The details are there in this particular slide itself. Let's move on to the next topic, household debt. Now, with respect to household debt, one important change or one recent development which has taken place in India is the household debt has drastically increased. That is, the borrowings by households has drastically increased, and this could have repercussions on the Indian economy. What kind of repercussions? If households have borrowed more amount of money, it means that they will have to pay more amount of interest on the loans which they have taken. More interest means what will happen to the demand for goods and services? Reduce. Second repercussion, if households have borrowed more amount of money and if they do not repay the loans which they have taken from banks, it will happen to financial position of banks. Financial position of banks might deteriorate due to increase in NPA. So this is a very important development which has taken place and which might well be asked in the upcoming prelims examination. Apart from that, there's something very interesting which is which is taking place in context of household debt. Everyone must have heard about K-shaped economic recovery in India's GDP. Similar to K-shaped economic recovery, the household stress in India, that is household debt in India, is also showing a K-shaped curve. So, what is this household debt? Why has household debt increased? What is this K-shaped curve in terms of household debt? All these things I have covered in much greater detail in one of the current affairs classes in the month of Jan. Because the topic is very lengthy, I can't afford to cover this topic once again in the class. So what I will do, I will share the link to this particular topic in the description box. Those of you who have not watched this particular topic, please take some time out, watch that particular discussion related to household debt. So in that particular discussion, I have covered all of these things. I've also covered what is K-shaped stress in the household debt as well. Coming to the next one about capital, which is gross capital formation, investment. Can you see here that in prelims 2024, there was a question with respect to different types of capital. Similarly, here there was a question related to what is capital output ratio and the kind of progress, what kind of progress it is. Like if you substitute steel for wooden flow, whether it is capital augmenting, labor augmenting, and those things. So questions might be asked with respect to important aspects related to capital formation, right? So let's understand what is this meaning of gross capital formation that we use to calculate our GDP. So when we say gross capital formation, GCF, gross capital formation includes three components, as you can see: gross fixed capital formation, changes in inventories, and changes in valuables. With respect to gross fixed capital formation, most of you must have heard about investment rate, right? So this investment rate itself, we call it as gross fixed capital formation. So this includes money that we spend on creation of assets, money which is spent to buy machinery and equipment, money which is invested in research and development, which may lead to development of patents, as well as changes in cultivated biological resources. Even this is also included. Now, there is a confusion as to whether research and development is included in the gross capital formation of India or not. What you should know that we brought about changes in our GDP methodology based upon the recommendations of a committee called as Sundaram Committee. So, based upon this particular committee's recommendations, we have decided to include research and development into gross fixed capital formation. So, there should be no doubt about it. Okay. So, this is what is gross capital formation. And you can just look at the trends in the overall investment rates of the Indian economy. So at the start of my discussion, I told you that the investment rate in India is somewhere around 31%, right? And you can see here that this particular investment has slipped to 3-year low, lowest in the last 3 years. Why it has reduced is because this particular graph shows the share of both public sector as well as private sector investment. And you can very well see from 1986 onwards, generally the private sector investment has been more than the public sector investment. But the problem is, in last few years, the private sector investment have dipped. That is the biggest concern. So we need to increase the private sector investment. So like I said, the investment rate, which is like 31%, should increase to at least 35%. And for that to happen, private sector investment should pick up. So this is with respect to investment. Apart from that, in the previous year prelims, as I showed you, there was a concept of capital output ratio. Similar to capital output ratio, there is another ratio called as incremental capital output ratio. These two ratios are very confusing for most of the students. Even this concept I have covered in one of the current affairs class recently. Those of you who have not watched this current affairs class on capital output ratio and incremental capital output ratio, please go through the description box, the link in the description box below, to understand the difference between the capital output ratio and incremental capital output ratio. In fact, in the same current affairs class, I have also taken up the practice questions also related to this particular concept. Now, let's move on to the last part of this particular chapter, which is about systematic deregulation. What is this systematic deregulation? Remember, I told you at the start of my discussion that government has laid on rules and regulations. These rules and regulations are laid down in order to protect the interest of labor. They are laid on in order to protect the interest of environment. So obviously the intention of the government is undoubtedly good to protect the welfare of certain sections of people. But the problem here is these rules and regulations laid down by the government are overly restrictive. Because they are overly restrictive, it is inhibiting, it is hindering the growth of private sector companies. Remember the example of regulatory cholesterol that I gave at the start of my discussion? That is what we are going to cover now. So economic survey this year has focused on systematic deregulation, that is reducing the rules and regulations so that the factors of production, that is land, labor and capital, can be more efficiently utilized. So you can see here Economic survey says that the need to find growth avenues in an export challenged, environment challenged, and energy challenged world means we need to act on systematic deregulation. There's a problem of geo-economic fragmentation. India cannot look outward. Because it cannot look more outward, it has to look more inward. And within inward, what we have to do is the efficiency with which we produce goods and services should increase. And that can be done by efficiently utilizing factors of production. So it says this can be done through focusing on a central element, that is economic freedom of the individuals and organizations to pursue legitimate economic activity, and this can be done through factor market regulations, easing the factor market regulations. So based upon the topic that we are going to cover, the main question for practice here is, though well intended, government regulations are hindering efficient utilization of factors of production. Explain the statement. That is how government regulations are hindering the efficient utilization of factors of production. Also discuss the strategies to be adopted for systematic deregulation for the factor market reforms in India. So let's get into what are these rules and regulations, how they are affecting our growth, and what we must do going forward. Let's see here. Okay. See, government has made different rules and regulations. And like I said, these rules and regulations have a good intention to protect the interests of workers, to protect the environment. But the problem is these rules and regulations are leading to inefficient utilization of factors of production, one being labor and the second being land or buildings. Let's understand how government rules and regulations are preventing the efficient utilization of labor. All of you must have heard about the debate on number of working hours in India, right? So with respect to the debate, economic survey has its own point of view. Economic survey says in India, the number of working hours that we have prescribed for our workers is quite less as compared to other countries. For example, in India, the number of prescribed working hours for our workers is 10.5, whereas in countries such as Vietnam, it is 12 hours, Bangladesh, it is 11 hours, and in China, there is no limit. So problem is when we put a limit on number of working hours, it means that labor as a factor of production is not efficiently utilized. Probably if the workers work for more number of hours, they may get more wages. So in a way we are hindering that from that to happen. Apart from that, the efficiency of production will also be lower because the labor as an input is there, but we are not being able to efficiently utilize this particular input. Like I said, there are two sides of the debate. I'm not getting into that side of the debate. I'm just presenting you with the point of view of economic survey. Second, in India, we prescribe for higher overtime wages. It means if someone is working beyond 10.5 hours, then they should get overtime wages, which is actually good intention because labor should not get exploited by the private sector companies. But the problem is the overtime wages that we are asking our companies to pay to wages is unduly higher. For example, the overtime wages in India is twice the normal wages, whereas in China, it is just 50%. So in a way, seeing it from the perspective of economic survey, if I'm an entrepreneur, if I want to employ my workers beyond 10.5 hours, I'll have to pay them double the wages, which will increase my production cost. So to limit my production cost, I will not probably employ my workers for overtime. in a way, it is hindering the growth of an industry. Same way, the government puts a number of restrictions on employment of women. For example, in most of the states, women are allowed to be employed only between 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. It means women cannot work in night shifts. The new labor code actually gives a kind of flexibility to the states, which wherein the states can enable working of women even in night shift also. But only few states like Karnataka have enabled the working of women in night shifts. Now, why is that important? It is being said that if you give more freedom to the organizations to employ women in the night shift, they will be encouraged to hire more number of women. Because of such restriction, organizations might not come forward to hire women, right? So imagine an entrepreneur has a choice to employ either male or female. He would generally prefer a male because he can ask a male to work in night shift, which he cannot ask for a female member. So in a way, it is affecting the employment creation among the women. Apart from that, we also prohibit women employment in certain activities which we think are dangerous, but in a way, it is affecting the employment of women. That's one of the reasons why the female labor force participation rate in India is around 37%, while the male labor force participation rate is almost around 78%. As far as utilization of land and buildings are concerned, this is a very interesting example given by Economic Survey. Let's say this is a public road, and along this public road, there is a small strip of trees or a forest, which is very thinly spread out. It's not very dense forest. It's a small strip of trees. What most of the states have done is the small strip of trees along the roads, they have declared it as a forest. Absolutely. It's a good intention because we would want to protect forest. We want to protect the environment. But this is creating problem for the industries. Why so? Think here, if there's an entrepreneur who has purchased a land here, and this entrepreneur has to provide access to this particular main road, he has to go through this particular strip of trees, which means he has to clear those trees. But in India, to clear forest, it is very cumbersome. You have to take n number of approvals to cut down trees and create road. So entrepreneurs in this particular case would spend substantial amount of their time, substantial amount of their efforts in getting approvals on clearing the trees and constructing a road, which in a way means that they have less amount of time to focus on their industry. It's like under opportunity cost, right? So that is the problem. Next one is, in order to ensure that workers in a industry, in a factory are not working in a very cramped space, government has laid on rules and regulations as to how much should be the floor space per worker. This is a rules and regulation which government has laid down, which is good. But the problem is the floor space per worker which we have laid down in India is considerably higher as compared to other countries such as Malaysia. So it is being said that if you could reduce the floor space per worker, then we can actually create more jobs, which is another facet of how regulatory cholesterol is affecting job creation in the Indian economy. Same way, we ask factories, industries to leave aside more space for providing facilities such as canteen or restroom, which is obviously needed, no doubt about it. But what if a industry has very less number of workers. Even then, the industry is required to keep aside certain percentage of land for canteen and restroom. So land or a building is not efficiently utilized. So overall, what I can say is the rules and regulations of the government is like one size fits all approach. Irrespective whether the industry is big or small, everyone is required to follow these rules and regulations. So you must understand it is quite easier for the big industries to follow these rules and regulations, but quite tough for small scale industries to keep aside, certain amount of land aside for canteen or a restroom. Similarly, government lays on parking norms in industrial and commercial plots, which means some amount of land should always be vacant for parking, which is needed. But the problem is, what if the commercial plot is very small? Probably parking space might not be needed at all. But even then, they have to keep aside some amount of space for parking. So based upon what we have covered, economic survey says that because of this over regulation by the government, there is monetary cost, opportunity cost, and state capacity cost. Monetary cost means entrepreneurs would have to spend substantial amount of money in complying with this rules and regulations. That is a cost. Opportunity cost means entrepreneurs would have to spend substantial amount of their time, efforts in following these rules and regulations, which means they have less time to focus on their own business or organization. State capacity cost means government, because it has laid on so many rules and regulations, it has to ensure that those rules and regulations are correctly followed. And to do so, government would have to hire more number of inspectors. It has to hire more number of officials, whether they are to check whether the rules and regulations are followed or not, which imposes a cost on the government also. So these are the three problems. So why should we go for systematic deregulation? Please have a look at the points. Number one, like I said, India now needs to focus on domestic factors, domestic levers, and efficiency of factors of production should increase, and that is possible through systematic deregulation. Second, like I said, it might be easier for the bigger industries to comply with these rules and regulations, but difficult for MSMEs. It imposes substantial burden on MSMEs with respect to rules and regulations. It will lead to efficient utilization of factors of production. And remember the term which I used, butterfly effect, multiplier effect. It is being said that if you go for systematic deregulation does not mean that you are doing away with all the rules and regulations. No, it's about having a right balance. Have only those rules and regulations which are utmost necessary, which can be enforced. So if we have that balanced regulation, the industries will grow, and if the industries grow, job creation will increase, and increase in job creation will help us become a Viksit Bharat as well. And other countries are also focusing a lot on improving their efficiency. The best example being US. US has set up a separate department of government efficiency, right? So this is why we need to go for systematic deregulation. What should be our strategy for systematic deregulation? Let's see this. Right now, government has started focusing on improving the ease of doing business, for which it has already focused on reducing compliance burden. It has streamlined the process and information, basically to make it easier for the industries to comply. We have undertaken digitization, and we also provide incentives. These are the things which we are already pursuing in phase 1 of ease of doing business. Not so important. What is important is the next part, because this should be pursued in the phase 2 of ease of doing business. This is the recommendation of economic survey. What is this phase 2? Let's understand. Number 1, economic survey says we have to undertake a comprehensive review of all the rules and regulations, and only those rules and regulations which we think is utmost necessary, we must persist only with those rules and regulations. Rules and regulations which we think is no longer necessary, or the rules and regulations which lead to substantial amount of monetary cost, opportunity cost, and state capacity cost that we discussed, those rules and regulations should be done away with. That is what is liberalizing standards and control. So we must adopt minimum necessary, maximum feasible approach. That's the first thing. Second, what we must do is, generally with respect to enforcement of rules and regulations, economic survey has pointed out that the enforcement of rules and regulations is quite arbitrary, and this in turn leads to harassment of the people who are running enterprises. For example, if someone is not following rules and regulations, without hearing their point of view, we simply impose penalty on such industries. Ideally, what should happen? We should follow principles of natural justice. What does principles of natural justice say? That every person has a right to be heard. So, if some enterprise is not following rules and regulations, first you must issue show cause notice to that particular enterprise asking, why are you not following the rules and regulations? Once you issue show cause notice, you must wait for their reply. Principles of natural justice. And once you get the reply, based upon that, you impose a penalty. That means there should be fairness in the way we enforce rules and regulations. Next, we must reduce the fees and tariffs that we're imposing on industries. For example, the industries are required to pay different types of fees to the state governments for taking approvals, right? So whatever fees which they are required to pay, those fees have to be rationalized, basically to reduce their cost of taking the necessary approvals. Now, this is very interesting. Risk-based regulation. What is this risk-based regulation? Generally, if you look at the way the government frames rules and regulations, the rules and regulations are framed based upon one size fits all approach. So government will make rules and regulations, let's say, related to fire safety, related to pollution norms. And these rules and regulations do not differentiate one enterprise from another enterprise. All the enterprises, irrespective of the risk involved, they are required to follow these norms. For example, think of it. If there is a restaurant and let's say there is a cinema hall. Now, what you must understand is, for a restaurant, what is a risk, a greater risk is the restaurant is actually faces a higher risk of pollution, right? Because it is using gas cylinders. It is also using gas cylinders which can face a risk of fire safety. So for restaurant, probably pollution norms and fire safety norms should be stringent. But think of cinema hall. For cinema hall, where is the pollution, right? For cinema hall, I think the risk is more of fire safety. So for cinema hall, the fire safety norms should be very, very stringent. Pollution norms, let's say with respect to cleanliness or something like that, there can be certain norms, but they should be less stringent. So what I'm trying to convey here is, based upon the risk involved, the rules and regulations should be either very stringent or less stringent. We cannot have one size fits all approach when it comes to enforcing rules and regulations. So these are some of the recommendations of the economic survey. And already budget has taken some important initiatives to undertake systematic deregulation. For example, budget has announced that we will set up a high-level regulatory committee for undertaking regulatory reforms, where it will review all the regulations. Like I said, we need to follow this approach, which is minimum necessary, maximum feasible approach. So this committee will try to identify the rules and regulations which may impose substantial amount of cost and should be done away with, and what is the minimum rules and regulations that should be imposed, that will be looked after by this particular committee. We are going to start a new index called as Investment Friendliness Index, basically to foster competitive federalism among the states to encourage more investment. So to get more investment, the state would have to improve the ease of doing business and liberalize the rules and regulations related to factor market, that is utilization of labor, land, buildings, and so on. We have proposed to come up with the Jan Vishwas bill. So earlier what used to happen was, with respect to non-adherence to rules and regulations laid on by the government, the punishment was, it was considered more to be criminal punishment, like it was considered to be a criminal offense. So we have decriminalized the offenses, and we have shifted those offenses to civil offenses. Accordingly, the Jan Vishwas bill has said that more such offenses will be turned from criminal offenses to civil offenses. And lastly, we have an organization in India called as Financial Stability Development Council. This organization is headed by Finance Minister, and it includes the heads of important financial sector regulators. That is, it includes the heads of regulators such as RBI, SEBI, IRDA, PFRDA. So basically, it is a tool, or this is an organization to promote sectoral coordination between different regulators. So this year's budget has said that FSDC will look into the impact of financial rules and regulations, and those financial rules and regulations will be further simplified. So these are some of the budget proposals with respect to improving ease of doing business. So finally, we have completed the first part of the discussion of budget and economic survey, wherein I have covered the background to budget and economic survey, and I've covered two important chapters from economic survey, that is chapter 1 and chapter 5. In the next video, I shall be covering the next part, that is public finance. In the public finance, I will be covering what is the present status of public finance, plus important budget announcements with respect to tax. So these things I will be covering in next video. Till then, keep studying. Thank you so much for watching.